Okay, we begin today the Gemara on Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis, the very last line, in the middle of this Mishnah. It's discussing various halachas regarding the mincha of the Sotah. So the Mishnah here says, Ve'elu sheminchaseyem nisrafes. The following are cases when the mincha of the Sotah is going to have to be burnt, and it's burnt on the side of the Mizbeach where the ashes are placed, and it cannot be brought as a carbon mincha. Ha'yimeres tmeya nilach. If she comes and admits and says, yes, I'm Tomei, I did the Aveda, so there's no point in her drinking the Sotah and not having the carbon of Sotah either. If witnesses came along and testified that she became Tomei, so it's also determined by the Eidim. She refuses to drink from the waters of the Sotah, so there's no point in bringing them in either. And the husband decides and says, no, I don't want to have my wife go through all of this. I don't want her to drink this. The whole thing is all by the initiative of the husband. He has to be the one that brings her if he doesn't want. Or, one of the conditions for a Sotah that the waters of the Sotah should work and it should be able to find out what happened is if the husband stayed separated from her from when this whole story happened. But if on the way going to the Beis HaMikdash, the husband had a relation with her, so then the water doesn't work. And another halacha the Mishnah says, "V'chol hanesuais lekayanim." Any woman that's married to a kayin, minchaiseyen nisrafais. Their carbon mincha also has to be burnt, has to be completely burnt. And the reason for this is we're not talking about here anything going wrong. Even if the carbon mincha is going to be brought properly, and usually what's done with the mincha we had before in the Mishnah, you take off a kaimitz, a fistful, and that's what's brought in the mizbeach, and the rest of the mincha, the kayinim can eat it. But over here, when it comes to a mincha where the husband is a kayin, because part of this mincha belongs to the husband is the one that has to buy this mincha for her. So therefore, the halacha by the carbon mincha of a kayin is that it has to be fully burnt. And this is a pasuk that it's learned out from. We'll see soon in the Gemara that this is the rule by the carbon mincha of a kayin that has to be fully burnt on the mizbeach. Every mincha. We'll see if it's mamish every. We'll see soon. We'll see in the Gemara. This will be one of the discussions in the Gemara. So the Gemara here spells out this, the Mishnah that is, spells out this in more details here. So that means as follows. Bas Yisrael shenisas l'kayin. If you have a wife, she's a Bas Yisrael, and she's married to a kayin, minchasa nisrefes. So her mincha has to be totally burnt. The kayhenes shenisas l'Yisrael. If it's the reverse, if it's a kayhenes, and she's married to a Yisrael, minchasa necheles. Her carbon mincha could be eaten like a regular carbon mincha. This special rule that applies to the mincha of a kayin is only if the zachar is a kayin. But if it's the woman that's a kayenes, this halacha does not apply. Her carbon mincha is treated like a regular carbon mincha. We're in the middle of the Mishnah. You're in the right place, I believe. Okay. Ma bein kayin lekayenes. Now this Mishnah brings a few different halachas. That is the difference between a kayin and a kayhenes. Minchas kayhenes, the first Mishnah brings this halacha we just said right now, that the mincha of a kayhenes, necheles, could be eaten, or minchas kayin, eino necheles. The mincha of a kayin is not eaten. Another halacha, kayhenes mischaleles. A kayhenes, if she gets married to someone that she's not allowed to someone that's puzzled to her, so she becomes mischaleles. Mischaleles means she becomes desecrated, meaning she does not now have any more the ability to eat from truma and so on, or from kahuna. So this she gets affected by marrying someone that's puzzled to her. But the kayin ain't mischalel. A kayin that gets married to someone that he's not allowed. For example, a kayin is not allowed to get married to a grusha, to a divorced woman. But even if he does, what happens is it affects his children. His children will become chalalim. But he himself does not get affected by this. He remains a kayin, a regular kayin. Another distinction between the kayin and the kayhenes. Kayhenes metame lemesim. The kayhenes becomes tamei, even to mesim. The whole halacha that a kayin may not become tamei to mesim does not apply to a kayhenes. But vein kayin metame lemesim. A kayin cannot become tamei to mesim. Kayin eichel bekache kachim. A kayin is allowed to eat kache kachim. Right, as we know, the Beis HaMikdash, there's kachim kalim that could be eaten in all of Yerushalayim, and then there's kache kachim, a higher level that could only be eaten in Dazara. Only a kayin could eat kache kachim. Ve'ein kayhenes eicheles bekache kachim. A kayhenes does not eat kache kachim. The Gemara will bring the pasuk for this. Ma bein ish liisha. The Mishnah goes on now to list a few differences between the halachas that apply to a man and a woman. Not lav dafka regarding a kain, but b'chlal, differences between a man and a woman. The list that the Mishnah gives here is interesting because it's an incomplete list. There's many more things that are distinctions between a man and a woman. Some of them are listed in a Taisvis here in Amud Beis. There's a Mishnah in Kiddushin that talks about the differences in halachas between a man and a woman. There's some basic things that the Mishnah here does not mention, but the Mishnah here gives a partial list. So the difference is ha'ish, peireya, upairim. The first difference the Mishnah brings up is actually regarding the halacha of a mitzayre, this week's parsha, that by a man, when he becomes a mitzayre and he has to go out of the machna, one of the halachas is that his clothing has to be torn and he has to allow his hair to grow long. But ve'ena isha peiras peiremes. This halacha does not apply to a woman. She doesn't let her hair grow long and she doesn't have to have torn clothing. Another halacha, ha'ish, madir as benay ben nazir. A man could take a vow that his son should be a nazir. We learned this in Masechta Nazir. This is halacha l'moshe misina, that a father could take naziris for his son. But ve'ena isha maderes beno ben nazir. A mother cannot take upon herself a vow for her son to be a nazir. Ha'ish migaleach al naziris aviv. A father that passes away, a father that had money that he put aside for a korban nazir, and he passed away. So the son could take that money from the father and bring it for a korban nazir. But ve'ena isha megalachas al naziris avia. But a woman cannot take this money from the father and bring it for a korban of naziris that her father left over. Ha'ish mekadesh is bitay. A father has the rights to marry off his daughter, to be the mekadesh's daughter. The father is actually the one that gets the kesef kiddushin when he marries off his daughter. But ve'ena isha mekadeshes as bita. But a mother does not have the ability, the rights to marry off a daughter. Another distinction is ish meiches bitay. A father sells his daughter to be a maid. Ve'ena isha mecheres es bita. But a mother does not have the right and the ability to sell the daughter to be a maid. Ha'ish niskal adam, by the punishment of skila, when a person is stoned to death. So a man, when this is done, so he's done without his clothing. But ve'ena isha niskala saruma. But this does not apply to a woman. A woman is not, this punishment is not done with her being undressed. We had this before in the Gemara. There's a machlekes about this. Ha'ish nitle, after this punishment, so the pasuk says that the person should be hung for that day, so people should see this. So this only applies to the man. Ve'ena isha nitlis, but it does not apply to a woman. Final distinction, ha'ish nimkar bignevasai, a man that stole and doesn't have money to pay. So what happens is the bezdin will go and sell him so that he should work for this person to pay up what he owes. Ve'ena isha nimkares bignevasa, but it doesn't apply to a woman. A woman is not sold for a gneve that she stole. Okay. So the Mishnah here will come back, as I pointed out before, to explain one halacha. This halacha, this is where the Mishnah Gemara starts off here with this halacha of the Mishnah, b'nigeya to the halacha of a mincha of a kayan. So the basic rule is, it's learned from a pasuk, that the mincha of a kayan cannot be eaten at all. It has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. Okay, second, Rashi actually before in the Mishnah, towards the top of the Yomid, brings the pasuk. The Gemara doesn't itself bring the pasuk, but towards the top of the Yomid, Rashi brings the pasuk, Kol minchas kayin kolil tia loise achal. That the mincha of a kayin has to be fully burnt, it should not be eaten. That's in the third line from the top of the page in Rashi. That's the basis of this Gemara. And here, the question is, what happens now when you have the mincha saita of the wife of a kayin? Now this mincha saita, on one hand, the husband, the kayin, has a partnership in this. He's the one that buys it with his money for his wife. But at the same time, though, he's buying it for her. And now she's also the owner of this mincha. So they sort of both have a part in this mincha. So do we give it the halacha of the mincha of a kayin that has to be fully burnt on the mizbeach? Or do we give it the halacha of a regular mincha? A regular mincha, only a fistful, a kaimitz is taken off to be burnt on the mizbeach, and the rest, the kayinim eat. So how do we treat this mincha? So here the Gemara brings a brayse, and we'll see there's two opinions about this. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brayse. Kol hanusuyis lekahuna. Anytime a wife is married to a kayin and they have to bring a mincha saita, so mincha sayem nisrafis. The mincha that the wife brings, Rashi actually says that this applies to a mincha saita, but not only a mincha saita. This applies to any other mincha. If this kayin's wife decides she wants to donate a mincha, and it comes from anything that she has. I mean, it comes from her husband. She takes the money from her husband and she brings this mincha. So then the same halacha will apply, that the mincha of the kayin's wife has to be completely burnt, like the mincha of the kohen himself. Keitzat. So what does this mean? Kohenes, Levia, v'Yisraelis. A wife, whether she's a Kohenes or Levia or Yisraelis, shenisas l'kohen, and she's married to her husband, a kohen. Ein minchasa necheles. Her mincha will not be like every mincha that most of it the kohenim could eat. Mipnei sheyesh loy chelik ba. Because the carbon mincha, the kohen, the husband, has a chelik in this. It's being brought from him, from his money. So therefore, the halacha of the mincha of the kohen that has to be burnt applies. But now, on the other hand, the Braisa says, ve'ena oile kolil, but you can't just burn it all on the mizbeach like the regular mincha of a kohen. Mipnei sheyesh la chelik ba. Because she also has a part in this. And if it, as far as her part is concerned, the halacha of a regular mincha should apply, that only the kaimitz, only the fistful is burnt on the mizbeach, and the rest of it should be eaten. So basically we have a problem here. So how do we treat this mincha? So Ella says the Braisa, what we do is, hakaimitz karev ba'atzmai. First, we treat it like a regular mincha of Yisrael, where you take off just the kaimitz and you burn that on the mizbeach. And then vashirayim, the remainder, which usually would be eaten, but over here, because it also belongs to the husband, which is the kohen, so hashirayim krevim ba'atzmam. All the leftovers then will also have to be burned separately on the mizbeach. That's the resolution for this. Till is the Braisa. So now the Gemara has a problem with this. Why? Fragt the Gemara, ikri kan. Why shouldn't we read here, or in other words, why shouldn't we apply over here the following rule that there is by all karbanis, including a mincha? And the rule is as follows: Kol shahu mimenu leishim. Whenever you have a carbon, that part of it was already burnt on the mizbeach, harehu beval saktiru. There's now a law that you're not allowed to burn the rest on the mizbeach. This is based on the pasuk where it says, Kol sa'ir v'chol devash le'saktiru mimenu isha l'Hashem. We say it every day in the karbanis, right? So over there we're saying that sa'ir devash, that honey, you should not bring from it a carbon on the mizbeach. Now the word mimenu in the pasuk is extra. Could have just said, don't bring on the mizbeach. Why does it say mimenu? So the pasuk is read separately. We read le'saktiru mimenu la'Hashem. Le'saktiru, do not bring on the mizbeach if it's a carbon that mimenu from it was already brought on the mizbeach. In other words, by every carbon there's the parts that are supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, and there's the parts that the kainim are supposed to eat. So when you already brought those parts that belong on the mizbeach, the remainder that belongs to the kainim, you're not allowed to bring that and burn it on the mizbeach. It's allowed. So over here, the problem is, with this mincha, what are you saying? You have a problem, you don't know what to do with it. The remainder, after the kaimet is brought on the mizbeach, should it be given to the kainim to eat and be treated like a regular mincha? Or should we burn it all on the mizbeach? Because the husband is a kain. What did the Braisa say? You'll take the kaimet and burn it on the mizbeach, and the remainder you'll also burn on the mizbeach. To be yaitze for both, for her and for him. But the problem is, once you burn the kaimitz on the mizbeach, so now there's a law that the remainder is not allowed to go and be burnt on the mizbeach. The remainder has to be eaten. So how can we do? How is this a resolution for this?
Put it both together.
But you can't do it l'chadchila, huh? But if you're doing it all together, so then you're treating it like basically like the mincha of a kain. But the problem is the isha is not does not have the halacha of a kain, so you can't. It has to be eaten. So here the Gemara explains what the Braisa meant. Answers the Gemara, Omar Yehuda Berei de Rab Shimon ben Pazi. What the Braisa meant is the masik luhu l'shem eitzim. What you do is this remainder. After you bring the kaimitz on the mizbeach, now you have the rest. You bring it on the mizbeach, but you bring it on the mizbeach not as a carbon. You bring it on the mizbeach with the intention that it should be like firewood, that should be there on the mizbeach. That is allowed. You can't burn it on the mizbeach as a carbon. Once the kaimitz is burnt, the remainder, there's a law that it can't, bal taktiru, it can't be burnt on the mizbeach. But if you're burning it, if you're just placing it onto the fire as firewood, that is allowed. And Rashi actually says that this, you sort of make a condition for this. You put the rest on the mizbeach, and you say, look, if it belongs to the husband, the kayin, so then I'm supposed to burn it on the mizbeach as a carbon. It all has to be burnt on the mizbeach. If I'm putting it on the mizbeach because it really belongs to the wife, which does not have the halacha of a kohen, so then I can't put it on the mizbeach as a carbon. Then I'm just placing it here on the mizbeach as firewood, and that's all. That's what Rashi says. Taisus over here says you don't have to make a condition because it's not like we're not dealing with a situation where there's a doubt. There's no suffix here. We know that part of it is from the husband and part of it belongs to the Isha. So there's both parts are true, and therefore you just have to place it on the mizbeach as firewood because of the part of the Isha. Now, what's the source of this concept? That as long as you put it on the mizbeach as firewood, then it's okay. Rabbi Eliezer, the Tanya we learned in the Braise, Rabbi Eliezer oime l'reach nichayach iyatamayla. This halacha that you're not allowed to bring it and burn it on the mizbeach. Once part of it was brought on the mizbeach, so that's only once. If you're bringing it up as a carbon, reach nichayach, which means it's being brought as a carbon. Aval atamaleu l'shum eitzim. But you are allowed to bring it onto the mizbeach if it is being brought just as firewood. That's okay. So over here as well, you can just bring it onto the mizbeach as firewood. Now this resolution only works according to Rabbi Eliezer. Not everybody agrees to this. Rabbi Eliezer says that as long as you're bringing it as firewood, it's okay. El Rabbanon, the less lahu high svare, what the Rabbanon in the Gemara of Zvachim, Rashi brings the source of this machlokes in the Gemara of Zvachim. The Rabbanon disagree with this. This is not a resolution. You're not allowed to bring it onto the mizbeach, whatever your intention is, whether you're bringing it as a carbon, whether you're bringing it as a firewood. You can't do this. So what could we do? So over here, in this situation, with this mincha of the Sotah, once you bring the kaimitz, what do we do with the remainder? You can't bring it on the mizbeach. There's a lav. On the other hand, not to bring it on the mizbeach is also a problem because it might belong to the husband, the kayin. Not might. Part of it belongs to the husband, the kayin, and it does have to be burnt on the mizbeach. So what do we do with this? So the Gemara answers, according to him, there's a different resolution. We have to do something else, and this is l'chayre what the Mishnah before said over here about what we do in this case. The avdi lahu Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon. What we do is what Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon said. The Tanya, so we learned in the Braise. So before I learned this Braise inside, let me just explain what this Braise is going to be bringing here. So until here, we had a rule in the Gemara that the mincha's kayin is different than a regular mincha. Regular mincha, you burn the kaimitz on the mizbeach, and then the rest, the kayinim eat. When it comes to the mincha of a kayin, so Rashi brought before the pasuk, kol minchas kayin kol tia. The Gemara will bring the pasuk soon. That has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. But all of this is, until now, we were talking about a minchas Sotah. That's what our Mishnah was speaking about. Or a minchas nedava, a kayin that decides to donate a mincha. But then there's another kind of mincha that a kayin could bring. And that's a minchas chayta. If a kayin sins certain averis, Rashi brings here a shvua that he said and he didn't keep the shvua, which is called the aver of bituis fasayim, or he becomes Tomei and he goes into the Beis HaMikdash. So he has an option of bringing a carbon mincha for this Aveda, and this is a different kind of mincha. It's not a minchas nedave, this is a minchas chayva. He's obligated to bring this for this Aveda. So over here, this mincha that the Kayin has to bring is not so clear what the halacha about this is. And here there's actually a three-way machlokes what we do with this mincha. And let's talk about two of the opinions which is relevant to the pshat that the Gemara brings over here. So one opinion is that the halacha of the minchas chayta is the same like every minchas nedava of a kayin. Just like the pasuk says regarding the minchas nedava of a kayin that it has to be all burnt on the mizbeach, we compare the minchas chayta, which is an obligation, to the minchas nedava, that it also has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. So that's clear, there's no problems. But then there's another opinion which the Braise here brings, Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, that says that if you look in the pasuk by the minchas chayta, you'll see that on one hand it's mashma that the minchas kayin, that's a chayva, is actually the same like the mincha of every Yisrael, and you have to bring the kaimitz on the mizbeach. But on the other hand, it's mashma on the pasuk that it's different from a Yisrael, and that it has to all be burnt on the mizbeach. So what do? So how do you treat this carbon? Sort of similar to the problem that we're having before regarding the Sotah. So by a minchas chayta, according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, there's also two different things that the pasuk says. On one hand, there has to be a kaimitz, like every Yisrael, like the mincha of every Yisrael. But on the other hand, it also has to be burnt on the mizbeach, like the mincha of a kain. So on that, the Braise over here comes and explains what Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon says you do with this minchas chayta. So the Tanya, Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon says, "Hakaimetz karev ba'atzmai." the kaimitz is brought separately on the mizbeach, as the pasuk indicates that by a minchas chayte, which is a chayva, not the minchas nedava of a kain, but the minchas chayva. So over there, the kaimitz has to be brought separately, and then v'hashirayim, the shirayim, the leftovers of the mincha, cannot be eaten like a regular mincha, because on the other hand, it's mashma in the pasuk that the mincha of a kain, even the minchas chayva of a kain, is also different. So mispazrin al beis hadeshen, it's going to have to be spread out on the beis hadeshen by the ashes and be burnt there. That's the halacha that Rabbi Elazar Rab Shimon says regarding every minchas chayva that a kain brings. So the Gemara is using the same resolution regarding the minchas Sotah that a woman, the wife of a kain, brings. That on one hand, the kaimitz has to be brought on the mizbeach for the fact that part of it belongs to her and it's treated like a regular mincha. But now the leftovers cannot be eaten because of the part that belongs to the kain, the husband, the kain. So what do you do with it? It's just spread out on the beis hadeshen, on the side of the mizbeach. That's this resolution. If you can't do what the Gemara said before, to bring the other parts as firewood on the mizbeach. Now the Gemara clarifies, as I mentioned before, the Gemara here is comparing that we're going to do by the Sotah like we do with the minchas chayte of a kain. This is all according to Rabbi Elazar Rab Shimon, but there's another opinion. Now, the Rabbanan disagree with this. And what did the Rabbanan say? By the minchas chayte of a kain, mentioned before, the Rabbanan's opinion is that it's the same like a minchas nedav of a kain. Just like the minchas nedav of a kain has to be totally burnt on the mizbeach, the minchas chayte of a kain is the exact same thing. It has to all be burnt on the mizbeach. So we don't have a source from the Rabbanan's opinion for this concept, that we should have this resolution by the Sotah. So the Gemara says, the Rabbanan that they argue on Rabbi Elazar Rab Shimon regarding the minchas chayte of a kain. It's a different type of mincha. As I mentioned before, there's the minchas nedave and the minchas chayte. So according to the Rabbanan, their opinion is that it's taka two different types of minchas, but we compare them to each other. And just like by the minchas nedave, it's all burnt on the mizbeach, the minchas chayte of the kain is also all burnt on the mizbeach. The bas hakravihi, it could all be brought and burnt on the mizbeach. But over here, when it comes to the mincha of this Sotah, that's the wife of a kain, I feel that Rabbanan maidu. Over here, the Rabbanan would agree that this is the only resolution, that the kaimetz will be brought on the mizbeach, because she does not have the halacha of a kain, so we have to bring the kaimetz separately on the mizbeach. And then the rest of it, you cannot eat because of the portion of the husband, and that, the kain, and that is going to have to be burnt on the beis hadeshen, like Rabbi Elazar Rab Shimon said regarding the minchas chayte. Okay, so what's the maskan of the Gemara? That you have two ifanim over here in the resolution with this carbon Sotah that belongs part to the kain and part of it belongs to the isha. One resolution is that all of it is burnt in the mizbeach. The only thing is that part which is after you bring the kaimitz, you have to just bring it as firewood. As long as it's brought as firewood, it's okay. Or the other resolution over here is that you're going to have to bring the kaimitz on the mizbeach, and the other part is going to have to be spread out on the beis hadeshen. It has to be burnt on the beis hadeshen. It can't be brought onto the mizbeach. Okay, let's go weiter in the Gemara. Sagt the Gemara, Bas Yisrael hanesua v'chulu. The next thing it said in the Mishnah was that you have a Bas Yisrael that's married to a kain. So this halacha that we just brought over here, the Gemara finally brings the pasuk, the source, that the carbon mincha of a kain has to be burnt on the mizbeach, all burnt. My time, what's the source for this? The amakra v'chol minchas kain kolil tiyeh. The mincha of the kain, that has to be all burnt on the mizbeach. Lo yisayachol, you can't eat it. So it says in the pasuk kain, and it refers only to the zachar, a kain, that his carbon mincha cannot be eaten at all. It's all burnt. V'loi kayanis, but not the carbon mincha that belongs to a kayanis. The next halacha of the Mishnah was kayanis mischaleles. Kayin a mischalel. A kayanis that gets married to someone that she's not allowed, so she becomes like a chalala. She can't eat anymore from truma, but not a kayin. Kayin marries someone that he's not allowed. He's not mischalel. Doesn't affect him. Minala, what's the source of this? The Makra, the pasuk says, "V'loi yechalel zaroi ba'amav." When a kayin marries a grusha, someone he's not allowed, so the zaroi, the children become chalalim. Zaroi mischalel, the children become chalalim, but v'hu enim mischalel. The kayin himself that married his grusha does not affect him. The next halacha, kohenes metame. A kohenes is allowed to become tame to a mace, but a kohen is not. What's the difference? My time, Amakra, Emoir el Akayanim b'nei Yarim. The pasuk clearly says that this halacha of not becoming tummy only applies to the b'nei Yarim, v'loi b'nei Sarim. It doesn't apply to the b'nei Sarim. Kayan eichel b'katche kachim. Only a kayan can eat from the katche kachim, but not a kayanis. The chsiv kol zachar b'nei Yarim yechleno. Pasuk clearly says only a zachar eats from the katche kachim. U'ma bein ishchulu. Then the Mishnah goes on to bring certain differences between a man and a woman. So the Gemara brings Tanir Rabbanon Ish Eli Ela Isha Ish. So this is the first halacha the Mishnah brings was regarding a mitzayre, that a kayin, a man that is has to leave his hair grow long, has to have his clothing torn, but not a woman. So Ish Eli Ela Ish. So the pasuk says Rechlal. It starts off by the halachas of the mitzayre, so it uses the words Ish. Right? The pasuk is Ish Tzerua Hu Tameh. So it sounds like all the halachas of that mitzayre only applies to a man. Isha Minayin. How do I know that the halachas of a mitzayre applies to a woman as well? Later on, the pasuk says vehatzarua. So here it's not talking specifically about a ish. It's hatzarua means harekan shnayim. So that includes both a man and a woman as well. In K ma tamad loyma ish. So why does the pasuk earlier say only a man? Le'inyan shalamata. Over there, this exclusion, that it's only a man and not a woman, relates to what the pasuk says later, that only ish paireya v'chulu, that only a man lets his hair grow long and has his clothing torn, but not a woman. So that's the source, the exclusion of a woman. The next halach it said in the Mishnah regarding a nazir, ha'ish madir es benoi benazir, ve'ein ha'isha madir es benoi benazir. A father can make his son a nazir, but not a mother. Rav Yechanan says, halachi benazir. This is a halacha l'moshe misinai, that a father could do this and not a woman, not a mother. Ha'ish megalech es al naziris aviv, ve'ein ha'isha megalachas al naziris aviyah. Only a man can take the funds that his father left over from his karbanis of a nazir and use it for the carbon, but a woman cannot take from these funds. Rav Yechanan says, halachi benazir. This is also halacha l'moshe misinai by nazir. Ha'ish mekadesh es bitai ve'ena isha mekadesh es bita. A father could be mekadesh's daughter and not a mother. Chsev, the pasuk says, es biti nasati leish hazeh. I gave my daughter to this man. I married her off to this man. The beginning of that pasuk is va'amar avia naira. This is what the father says. So only a father could say this, and not a mother. Ha'ish meicheres bita ve'ena ish meicheres es bita. A father sells his daughter, but not a mother. The father that sells his daughter. Ha'ish niskal adam chulu. Only a man is the skila is adam, but not a woman. My time, the pasuk says v'ragmu oisai, that he should be stoned to death. So now my oisai. Why does it say that only oisai, only the man gets this punishment of skila? Now if you'll say oisai v'loy oisa, maybe this entire punishment of skila applies only to a man and not to a woman. But Vaksev, there's another pasuk that clearly says, V'itzeisa es ha'ishahu, oyes ha'ishahi, so it clearly says the man or the woman, that both of them, the punishment of skila applies. So Ella, oisai, beloy ksusai, oisai means that only by the man does he get the skila without clothing, but v'loy oisa, beloy ksusa, but that does not apply to a woman. Ha'ish nitle ve'ein chulu. My time on Makra, the pasuk clearly says, "V'salisa oisai al eitz," that the man is hung on the tree, "V'l oisai v'loy oisa," the man and not the woman. Ha'ish nimka b'gnevasai ve'ena ish nimkeres hiisha nimkeres b'gnevasa. A woman is not sold if she stole and she doesn't have what to pay. My time on Makra, the pasuk says, "V'nimkar b'gnevasai," that the man is sold for what he stole. B'gnevasai v'loy b'gnevasa, only for the man and not for the woman.